Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. My name is Grant Kastner. I am Extempore's community manager here as on our Thursday, this fourth day of our PD Extravaganza 2022, presenting you the fantastic Dr. Rich Madel, the past, present, future of world language teaching, and you, of course. I wanted to add just a little bit of background to this, just behind this presentation and how it came up. I just think it's interesting to say. Thomas and I, one of my other marketing colleagues here at Extempore, we saw this tweet one day that Rich sent out about communicative language teaching and the positive effects and the negative effects. And we just that'd be a really cool session to host. And so we reached out and we wrote to Rich, and he was like, yeah, sure, totally down. And here you are, right in our PD Extravaganza 2022. So hope you all enjoy, and I will pass it off to Rich. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant. And thanks to everybody for being here. I got to be honest, I am humbled to be on a slate of some really, really impressive presenters. A lot of the presenters that have been here this week and are also still to come. I mean, these are folks that I read in grad school. I mean, these are really impressive individuals. So again, I'm thrilled to be here. There's an addition to the title of this session. If you go on Sched, it's going to say the past, present, future of world language teaching. It's imperative for me that we include that and you aspect to this session, because I'm going to present a lot of information, but I really encourage all of us here in attendance to really interpret these ideas through your individual contexts, through your individual teaching practices, through your individual experiences, because I think that's really key and critical to where we're going and how we can make an impact. Also to that end, this is an open mic session, so I want you to feel free as much as you would like to be able to open the mic, to interrupt, to engage, to add questions, to add thoughts. That is totally fair game. So that being said, as Grant mentioned, my name is Rich Madel. I am a Spanish teacher by trade. I also chair the Department of World Languages in my district from our middle school through our high school. And I got to say that one of the things that I've done in that role, but also kind of throughout my career, is I've really focused on how can we support language teachers in improving their practice. My main driver is that I believe in what quality language instruction can do and how it can benefit students and how it can benefit an entire generation. And it is my belief that we can really make the biggest impact by helping teachers be the best versions of themselves in their classrooms. And so that has kind of been my target in the district. I've really focused on making our curriculum and making our pedagogical development, our professional development as high quality as possible. So that being said, to kind of get into what we're doing here, here's what we can expect from our time together. Let's see if we can move this session forward. There we go. So we're going to break this up into 4 parts. We want to focus first on the past. We're going to look backward. We're going to see kind of where we've been. We're going to take a historical approach. From there, we're going to focus on, okay, well, where are we now? That's going to lead into the third section where we're going to try to understand that a little bit better. We're trying to dig a little bit deeper into that aspect of the now. And that's going to lead us then finally into, okay, well, now what? Where can we go, and what can my role or our role be in a more communicative future? So let's begin. And I'm sure everybody's really excited. Got ourselves a little bit of a pop quiz. Oh my God. Don't worry. I really was just looking for any excuse to add that monkey face to this presentation. So that being said, when we talk about popular methods throughout the years, you may or may not be familiar with some of these approaches or methods to language teaching. So here's going to be our first challenge, and you can do this in the chat just so we can kind of see a variety of different interpretations. Are you able to define or describe the techniques associated with any of the popular methods that I have here? I have the proficiency approach, I have a direct method, the silent way, the audiolingual method, total physical response, grammar translation. Do any of those ring bells? And if so, can you describe them? Can you define them in the chat? Let's take a minute or two and see what kind of interpretations we have here. You can pick any one. You can pick all 6 if you're an overachiever like Vinny. Sure, Florency is already, she's got her 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ready to go. You're right. You're right, Florency. Language is on tape. TPR having to do with acting things out, right? Nice. Grammar translation, emphasis on conjugating verbs in a bunch of different tenses, audiolingual, repetition, imitation, emphasis on the oral. Anything else? A lot of drill work in audiolingual. Yep. All right, here's another challenge. Direct method, learn a second language just as the first. Did not know that proficiency was a method. You're right, proficiency is not a method. This is just one of the terms that we're gonna use when we take the historical perspective. You're right, Claudia. All right, here's our second challenge. Here's our second challenge. Can you place these methods, these eras in chronological order from when they first gained popularity? I added some letters here, so if you wanna use the letters in the chat. Where did we start? Where are we now? So we have F seems the oldest. D sounds like the oldest. Not sure where C. It's a pure guess from Grant. I'm seeing some overlap in our responses, though. Let's take another moment for those of you that are venturing to guess in the chat here. All right, so let's take a look. Let's take a look together. What I want to do is I want to kind of, I want to describe, I like that there are a lot of question marks in the responses here, making us feel nice and confident. In fact, just so we kind of get a baseline, can you put how you feel in the chat in terms of a 1 being I don't feel comfortable at all with identifying these past methods or these past eras, or a 5 being I feel pretty confident? Where do we fall on that spectrum of 1 through 5? 2s, 3, 3.5. Okay, that's just such an overachiever. Okay, so so it looks like we're somewhere in the middle, biasing, in fact, the not so comfortable. All right, so let's take a look together. That makes me feel good. That makes me feel like we're here with a purpose. I like that. All right, so looking at language teaching over time, the first place that we need to start is kind of an era where Latin and Greek really reigned supreme in terms of the target language and in terms of the purpose of learning languages in general. And this was really, this era lasted centuries, and really up until the 19th century. This was the predominant language teaching method over time. And what we found and what we saw, what was experienced during this time was really the grammar translation method. Now, what do we mean by the grammar translation method? We're talking about as you would imagine, a heavy emphasis on translation, of going from the target text into the learner's first language. A very explicit approach to language learning, really via explicit grammar instruction. Language learners were focused on being able to learn about the target language and using that knowledge to decipher target texts. Memorization of word lists and vocabulary that was bilingual in nature, right? Target language, first language, and very little emphasis on oral production. Again, the true target here was being able to access not necessarily target language communities, but rather target language archives of texts to be able to access knowledge and be able to access a historical perspective. Now, in reaction to the grammar translation method in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, this is where the direct method comes along. The direct method began to actually use the second language in its teaching. There was visual support to make meaning. And again, kind of took an inductive approach to grammar rules. Native-like pronunciation was emphasized. And so now we are getting into some target language production where native-like pronunciation was in fact the target. Around 1940, this is when the behaviorist movement arrived in lots of different teaching contexts. And so it shouldn't really be much of a surprise that the language learning context also saw some aspect of the behaviorist approach. This is also where psychology and really just oral proficiency in general took an emphasis. And so this is where we see the audiolingual method gaining popularity. And audiolingual method, as a lot of you mentioned in your descriptions, this is a stimulus response, a pattern drill. This is very often choral responses where you're just repeating messages, and the idea being that if you repeat these messages over time, that it will end up becoming language in your brain. Again, taking the behaviorist approach, corrective feedback was an absolute must. The idea that you could kind of correct your way into native-like proficiency was the idea here. There were comparisons between mihi nomen est pugnax. I still remember that from Latin class as well, if I just repeated it enough. This also took, it took a certain pattern in terms of what came first and what came last, where listening happened first, and from that listening, you were able to repeat and therefore speak. And then from that drill and repetition, you were then able to read. And then lastly, you were able to write and produce. But again, this is where in Florencia's workshop the other day, where she was talking about interpersonal speaking, and she used the idea of the memorized dialogue. And is that in fact interpersonal? And of course it's not. That's an audiolingual, that's a relic from this audiolingual era, this idea that we're going to create this dialogue and we're just going to memorize it so that we can produce it and repeat it and sound native-like, right, on its surface. But really, once you scratch that surface and you recognize not a lot of language learning, not a lot of language acquisition was happening there. And so we continue on. And then once we get into around the 1950s, the 1960s, the field of second language acquisition research, the field of first language acquisition research began to kind of flourish. And in reaction, we see methods stemming from that. In and around the 1960s, Noam Chomsky gained popularity through the universal grammar theory, this idea that we have this innate capacity, just as human beings, we have an innate capacity to learn languages. And so as a result of that, we see in the 1970s, we see a lot of these natural approaches, these ideas that let's try to create a classroom that circumvents the student's first language and just goes right in to tapping into a natural approach. So this is where we see the total physical response, where students are making target language and and sensation connections, not target language and first language, but we're associating meaning with movements, with actions, and with pictures, for example. The natural approach later on, Terrell's natural approach later on was this idea of let's create a learning context that mimics the first language in as much as possible, this immersive context. The silent way was an approach, again, kind of building off of a lot of the total physical response, the natural approach, building off of all of those, but with a lot more patience in terms of the oral production, recognizing that comprehension is going to come first and that the oral production is going to come a lot later. The effective factors here begin to play a really important role. This idea that there are in fact classroom anxieties and that we want to be careful about how we treat them in a learning context. That's really taking a lot of emphasis kind of in the 70s and early 80s. Then we move in to the proficiency era. This is where ACTFL, in fact, deserves a lot of credit. It was around 1986 that ACTFL really took the lead in terms of defining proficiency as a key feature of the language classroom. And there's no one method. This was, I think Claudia mentioned this, the proficiency doesn't have a method. And you're right, there was a lot of different methods that combined, but in the proficiency era, this is where self-expression, creativity, communication, and an emphasis on does the expiration date? No, it doesn't, in fact. And as we move on from the proficiency era and we kind of go into the standards-based era, what we see is we really see an amalgamation of the proficiency era. We see an amalgamation of all of what we learned from the first and second language acquisition research. But what we're doing is we're kind of applying certain standards to the classroom expectation. This is really where we get the content-based instruction, the idea that we should be teaching other information using the target language in our classroom. Culture begins to take a new form in this standards-based era. Certainly the products, practices, and perspectives are also taking form here. Is AI next? Josh, I don't know. And for our sake, let's hope not. So that's where we see it over time. Now, that's not to say that this is directly linear. That's also not to say that there aren't detractors throughout this period. And in fact, when we take a look at the grammar translation method, I come from St. Joseph's University, where Ignatius of Loyola played a pretty important role in the basis of our content. And he was born in 1491. He was quoted as saying that grammar instruction is the medieval approach, and he was completely against this idea that we should just be learning about languages. Instead, what he proposed was this idea of teaching languages in the target language so that we can actually access not only the archive of texts, but we could also become conversant, we could become contributors to these target language communities as well. Way ahead of his time, I would say. So when we kind of take a look at all of this, especially in the proficiency era and the standards-based era, we begin to hear this idea of the paradigm shift. There's a lot of information here, and I don't want to read all of you. But when we talk about the paradigm shift, what we're talking about is that concept of moving away from learning about languages to students using language for communication. It's not a teacher-centered approach, but rather a student-centered approach where the teacher's facilitating language. Again, I don't want to read everything on the screen here, but there's certainly a lot of information going on there. Florencia, you have all these connections. Again, we're all jealous. We get it. We get it. All right, so that kind of gives us a sense of where we're coming from. Now the question is, where are we currently? And so I want to leverage the work by Burke, where she described certain rituals, and we can consider these rituals practices of really the deep structure that's going on in modern world language classrooms. And so I want you to ask yourself, how different, how far removed are we from where we began in, let's say, Ignatius of Loyola's time? Brigitte Burke identified let's say 4 different rituals that had to do with the use of
Hurry and
translation,
lunch.
that had to do with the use of, or the teaching of grammar, that had to do with the 90% target language goal from ACTFL, and had to do with culture. Now, I don't want to tell you what she found. Instead, I want you to make some sort of prediction. I invite you to do so in the chat. You can pick any of these practices, any of these concepts, and based on your experiences, based on your knowledge from the field, what do you think she found in regard to these concepts of practices? Can you fill in some of the gaps here? What do you think she found about how grammar was presented, about how the 90% target language goal is experienced in our classrooms today? What about the presentation of grammar? What do you think she found in classrooms today? I'll give us a couple minutes where we can kind of share our thoughts in the chat. You can pick anyone you'd like, or for Dr. Henshaw, you can do all 4. So older antiquated methods like grammar translation are still present in many classrooms. So in that case, we'd say that there's a lot of use of grammar, a lot of use of translation. Claudia is just saying we're just kind of adding things up as we go. Still many of the belief from the past. So again, I would argue that that's saying that there's a lot of use of grammar, a lot of use of translation. Sarah's still experiencing the program using translation method. Cultured as a side note, just kind of factoids, fun facts. Culture portion is minimal and problematic. Nice. Any other ideas? Give another 30 seconds. Yeah, you know what? The term deep structure, she cites, and it escapes me at the moment, but as you take a look at her work, she cites that concept of deep structure from someone else. And like I said, it's escaping me at the moment. Using eclectic methods, a combination of all of them. Target language use, maybe it was 90 to 100%, but not really comprehensible. Interesting. So just striving to meet that target, whether or not students can understand doesn't matter. 90% is not something that I hear much. Sarah, you and I need to chat. We need to get you connected to some folks who are in the know. All right, so I need to unpack that. Oh my God. All right, let's move on. Sarah, I'm going to give you my email address at the end. All right, write it down. Let's connect. All right, so I'll fill us in. So what did she find about the use of translation? What she found is that the use of translation was highly prevalent in the decontextualized presentation of vocabulary. And we're talking about word lists. You know it. We're talking about, let's just throw a bunch of expressions out. And so long as I tell you what they mean in a language that we share, you're going to learn languages that way. That's something that's still happening. Relative to grammar, we're talking about lots of forced output. We're talking about a very behaviorist version, right versus wrong. Your language is either correct grammatically or it is incorrect. Because of this emphasis of explicit grammar instruction, sentence level discourse, so just focusing on utterances that are only getting to one sentence. It's non-contextualized. Students tend to be bored and unmotivated when they need to learn grammar. Memorization was key, and a strong relationship with the textbook as a result, or maybe because of. In terms of the 90% target language goal, just simply not met. English was really the primary language, the primary instructional language in teacher-student interactions, student-teacher interactions, and also peer-to-peer interactions, often a result of difficulty completing a communicative task in the target language. Now I'm going to show you something else that kind of corroborates this finding. This was a study done in 2013 where it took a look at comparing self-reported target language use in the classroom versus actual observed use of target language in the classroom. And just taking a look at the goal, only 40% of those who participated in the study had the goal of at least 90% of the target language. Where we're seeing, in fact, the majority of those who participated in the study, the goal was in a range between 80 to 70% of their practice. Just think of that. And then we get into the actual use. The actual use of the target language was markedly lower than their goal, their target use. And what we're seeing here is that the majority of our colleagues are not using the target language more than half of the time. Let's let that sink in. Again, we kind of go back into what we know from the research in second language acquisition, how important it is that input plays in the acquisition process. This is problematic. That being said, we mentioned, some of us mentioned in the chat, the idea of culture just being a kind of just a fun fact. And indeed, that's what you found. It's abbreviated at best. It's often presented in English, not in the target language. And it's something that's identified as separate, as this isn't really the focus of what we're doing here. The focus is language. And this is just as something apart. So a little conjecture on my part. So as a result of those 4 rituals, right? The as a result is in my opinion, as a result of the practices that we see and that we observe in our classrooms today, students are losing interest. They abandon study well before actually becoming proficient. This is on record. And something else, and this is what Grant mentioned that caught his team's eye, is I made the connection as well, is that as student interest wanes, classroom management issues increase. Teachers feel less, they feel less effective in their practice. Their enthusiasm for what they're doing in the classroom wanes, their commitment wanes, and they are therefore more likely to leave the classroom. And so this is where I go back to, if we believe in what we're doing, we have to recognize that we are at critical mass and that this is problematic. And in fact, why does teacher attrition matter? This is the worst on record, and that was 5 years ago. COVID-19 has exacerbated these concerns, and we know that world language positions are often the most difficult to fill. More disappointing news. We take a look at degree trends from 2009 to 2019. A decrease of 44% in terms of the world language education certifications are being produced in the bachelor's and master's level in the United States. In Pennsylvania, that decrease is 65%. Again, if we believe in what we're doing, this reality needs all of our attention. And that's where the past, the present, the future, and you come into play, because I think that we really need to take ownership of this, and we need to do our best to support our colleagues. So that being said, this is kind of a grim reality, but let's talk about understanding the present. Okay, and so when we take a look at those 4 rituals that Burke identified, in my opinion, what is the common thread between those rituals, between those classroom practices, is the teacher's belief that grammar instruction must be explicit and it must be central to the language learning experience. There may be some others who come to a different conclusion, but that's going to be mine. And through that end, what I wanted to do is I wanted to really understand the teacher's perspective of explicit grammar instruction in their practice. And so I asked a question: what do world language teachers perceive as influential on their teaching practices? Let's just figure out what's influencing how they approach the classroom. And once we identify that, I asked another question. I said, well, what's the relationship then between those influential factors and their value of explicit grammar instruction? Because with that, what we can do is we can begin to make relationships, and we can begin to figure out, well, what's associating with these teachers' increased perceptions, the value of explicit grammar instruction, and then also the negative, the inverse, what's associating with a decreased value of explicit grammar instruction, an increased value of communication instead. So what I did is I surveyed about over 600 language teachers in the United States. I asked them a really quick survey of how do they rate certain variables of influence, and then I ran a correlation analysis to see if we can understand it even better. But again, before I show you the goods, let's predict. If you were to come up with that survey, what do you believe are the most influential variables on world language teachers' classroom practices? Feel free, let's make the chat an avalanche of factors. What is influencing how a teacher goes about their practices in their classroom? Language teachers in particular. AP and IB tests, right? So assessment, how they learn languages themselves. Ooh, planning time, interesting. How they were trained. Politics of schooling, interesting. Textbooks, personal beliefs, experiences. What the students say they want to read, interesting. The latest trends. Students' proficiency, interesting. Take another 30 seconds to see if we have any other ideas in there. All right, so personal relationships, empathy. Wow, these are all really interesting influences and variables. And I have to say, in this study in particular, I mentioned as limitations the researcher's bias, because what I did is I did my best to kind of review the field, and I came up with 10 variables. But I really think that any one of us could use our own experiences or review the literature from the field and come up with 10 separate variables. And I think that's important to kind of keep in mind. College coursework, available funds, interesting. What professors in the major expect students to know? Right. All right, so I'll show you. So the variables that I identified, and I'll also show you where they fall in terms of how influential these teachers rated them. So we're going to see on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being influences them completely, 0 being does not influence them at all. And these are my 10 variables, where their previous learner experiences. Some mentioned in the chat this idea of how they were taught. This turns out to be pretty influential. This idea of I am teaching because of the experiences that I had as a learner. Second language acquisition research is also pretty influential on language teachers' practice. University methods courses, somewhat influential on how language teachers are engaging their practice. Textbooks tend to be the least influential of these variables. Online professional learning networks, pretty influential. The sense of plausibility, this is an interesting concept. This comes from a researcher, his last name is Prabhu. The sense of plausibility is this idea of, I just know this is what works. I've accumulated experiences over my career, and I just know it works. What ends up happening with this sense of plausibility is it often becomes self-affirming, is I have done this, and I have done it, and it works, and therefore that becomes my bar of what I keep doing. And because I'm setting that bar, I am always making sure that I am personally satisfied with the result. Informal collaboration tends to be pretty influential. Formal world language professional development, think conferences, think workshops, pretty influential. And then that concept of assessment as well, pretty influential. I think Grant was the one who mentioned the AB exam or the IB, but also think of your own classroom assessments. All right, now this, actually, you know what, I mentioned, I threw in one extra variable in here, and this goes on a different scale. I also wanted to just understand teachers' sense of self-efficacy. And so this isn't an influential scale. This is just, are they perceiving themselves as highly self-efficacious, moderately self-efficacious, or low? And this will help with our correlation analysis. And of the 600 plus that I identified, I would say that they felt pretty self-efficacious. In other words, they felt pretty confident that they were effective in their practices. All right, so this is where we're going to get into a little Price is Right. If you want to keep your cameras off, keep your cameras off. You can do this in the chat. At this point, what I want to do is I want to share with you the relationships that were made between these variables and the teacher's value of explicit grammar instruction. Now, when I do this, I'm going to show you the correlation coefficient. According to Cohen's interpretation, we're going to use this. And if you're not familiar with this kind of analysis, a 0 means that there's no relationship whatsoever. A 1 means that there's a completely identical relationship. If we're between maybe 0.1 and 0.3, it's a small relationship, but there is a relationship. A medium relationship is 0.3 to between 0.5 more or less, and a large relationship is 0.5 to just 1. So let's start with the previous, how I learned as a student. Do we think that this is a large, small, positive, negative? Do we think this correlates positively with explicit grammar, the value of explicit grammar? In other words, the more that someone says, I teach the way that I learned, positive means they value explicit grammar instruction. Negative means they don't. I'm explaining this really poorly. I'm just going to go through it. For the sake of time, let's just go through it. What we see here, this is a positive relationship, and this is a small but a positive relationship. In other words, the more that a teacher says that I teach the way that I was taught, the more likely they are to say that explicit grammar instruction is valuable in their practice. Second language acquisition research has a negative relationship. So in other words, the more that someone says that second language acquisition research is influential in their practice, the less they value explicit grammar instruction in their practice. University methods courses, I am sorry to say, this is a positive, a statistically significant positive relationship. In other words, the more that they say that university methods courses influence their practice, the more likely they are to value explicit grammar instruction. Textbooks demonstrated the strongest relationship here. This is a very large correlation with the influential value of textbooks and the value of explicit grammar instruction. Online PLNs, a moderately strong negative relationships. In other words, the more that teachers are saying, I'm influenced by my online professional learning networks, the less likely they are to value explicit grammar instruction as central in their practice. This sense of plausibility correlates positively. Informal collaboration showed no significant correlation. Formal world language professional development showed a negative relationship, a negative, moderate, medium effect. Assessment showed no statistically significant relationship, but there's a caveat here. What I did, I went back and I asked the participants to rate their assessments on a scale of communicative to assessment, communicative to accuracy based. And I broke them up into 3 groups. And what I found is that any of the teachers that said that there was an accuracy, there's an accuracy element to their assessment, they did in fact find that their value of explicit grammar instruction rose. Again, it's no surprise there. And then lastly, this idea of self-efficacy, this shows a negative relationship. So in other words, the more self-efficacious that teachers feel, the more effective that they feel in their classroom, the less likely they are to be valuing explicit grammar instruction in their practice. So all of this being said, when we take a look and we put this together, we see, in my opinion, how language teaching practices are passed over time. And it tends to be pretty cyclical, where in other words, we're seeing these experiences learners as influential. That then goes into their experiences of learn of language methodology, where they also have opportunities to see teachers in the field, but we have to wonder, are they seeing the best practices in the field? And then we see these experiences as an educator, which, as I mentioned before, are oftentimes self-affirming and are oftentimes siloed, where in that silo, where are they getting influences and what's happening in their practice? The textbook tends to play a really important role there. Now, let's take a look at the future, though, because I believe that we can kind of disrupt that cycle. And so I have a different version of the way that language pedagogy needs to be transferred over time. And in this version, we see these same three phases, but instead I'm going to add two different phases here. Phase 4 is where we get to disrupt those pedagogical beliefs, and phase 5 are those post-disruption experiences as a communicative educator. Now, this phase right here, this is where you come in. I mean, listen, it is July 21st. A lot of us haven't taught in the last month, but here we are, nonetheless, focusing on our own professional development. You are the teacher leader. And so this is where you come in as the servant leader, the servant teacher, to really focus on disrupting the field's beliefs and move that paradigm shift along even further. Now, how can we do that? What does that look like? What does it look like when teacher leaders are taking action? First, I believe that we all need to be contributing to online professional learning networks. And not even just contributing, just go be a part of it. There's so much that we can learn from these online networks, and the contribution part can just come very naturally. I want to pause here, and I want to make sure that we are all in the loop in terms of what are the professional learning networks that we could participate in. What are some of the ones that you participate in? Take a look at the chat. What are some of the online networks of your colleagues that you're a part of, that we should be a part of? That's right. Our state foreign language associations have an online footprint. What about our online communities? So I'm going to throw it out there. I think Twitter is a really, really active. There it is. Get on Twitter. Follow the hashtag LangChat. It is a really robust and active community of language teachers who are sharing ideas constantly. The Actful SIG communities, absolutely. Facebook, Cami, what kind of Facebook groups? Facebook groups absolutely count, Florencia. Can we name some? What are some really active or some really beneficial Facebook communities that we should be taking a look at? Nice. I'm thinking, international professional for sure. I'm thinking some of the ones that I know that are active on Facebook, the CI TPRS, that tends to be a really active group. Tech for, yep. Florencia herself moderates a couple of these communities. Spanish teachers in the US, correct, Chris, correct. So these are the kind of online networks that just by their very nature, they're there to serve the community. And there are often more lurkers than there are contributors, but that's okay. But what I'm suggesting is, as the teacher leader, be active in those communities, challenge ideas, offer ideas, throw out resources. One of the most impressive things about the language teaching community that I think is unique from other disciplines is how freely teachers are willing to share their ideas, how freely they're willing to share their resources as well. It's pretty impressive. All right, what are other ways that teacher leaders can take action? Present at conferences. A lot of the chat has already mentioned this idea of state and regional and local associations being really active networks of language teachers. Present. If you are already someone that has presented, or you have a kind of a legacy of presenting, take some of your more or your less experienced colleagues, add them as co-presenters, initiate them, ingratiate them into the conference experience, and allow them to kind of work their way into presenting at conferences. Because again, that's how this cycle moves forward. That's how we break the cycle, we move it forward. Publish reflections. This is an opportunity for you to really to put your ideas, your classroom ideas, your own action research, share it with a community of language teachers. And this is where I'm going to throw this out again. Are there any places that we know of that we can publish our ideas? So for example, in Pennsylvania, our state association has a biannual publication that is always looking for teachers, from classroom teachers, to share their experiences. NECTFL has just released a version of the NECTFL review that includes kind of like a teacher's corner, where they're inviting teachers to share their perspectives as well. FLT Mag, that's right. Informal blogs, absolutely, Grant. A lot of teacher blogs. That's another aspect of the teacher community in world languages that is really, really strong. YouTube channels, for sure. Social media, no doubt, no doubt. Anything else we're missing? Any other places where we can find? Okay, all right, moving on. Informal conversations, for sure, for sure. One of the things that teacher leaders can do as well is interpret research. One of the things that we find in the field of language teaching and also in the field of second language acquisition is that there tends to be a bridge, a really deep bridge between the boots on the ground and those in the high academic ivory tower. And oftentimes it takes teacher leaders to interpret, to translate the second language acquisition research into a way that is more palatable, that is more accessible to the teacher who may not have the time to stay abreast to research, that may not find that the way that second language acquisition research is presented is necessarily easy to interpret. It's oftentimes written in a register that's beyond a lot of us that are in the classroom. And so you can take the lead in interpreting that research. Right, the OASIS summaries, for sure, for sure. I also think of like the We Teach Language podcasts, the Unpacking YouTube channel, absolutely. There it is, Florencia's YouTube channel, which is also a podcast in and of itself, for sure. I think it's safe to say that Florencia is the teacher leader, okay? We get it, we get it. All right. Become a mentor. A lot of state associations have mentorship programs already established. If there's not a mentorship program in your local association, in your state association, you get to be the one to make it happen. In this upcoming NECTFL review, I have a publication coming out that describes the step-by-step processes that I took to establish a peer mentoring program in the state of Pennsylvania. I published it specifically so that it can be replicated wherever else it may find benefit. ACTFL has a peer mentorship program, and there's also links in the chat. But be a mentor. Find our colleagues that are new to the field and really take them under your wing. The first 5 years are critical in new teacher attrition. And I'm going to throw out one more, and that's the idea of just opening your door. This tends to be the biggest hurdle for teachers, this idea of allowing teachers to come in and observe you. Florencia, I'm sure you can tell me in the chat, Stacy Margarita Johnson and Maris Hawkins, where did they recently publish an article about the idea of this peer-to-peer observation? Was that the NECFO review as well?
España.
España, okay. But the idea of peer-to-peer observation is so powerful. You get, as the teacher leader, be the first to open your door. Show that this doesn't need to be as intimidating as it feels. One of the things that I did here in the building that I teach is we created a culture of just having an open door policy. I lobbied the building administrators to provide coverage if we wanted to just go leave for 30 minutes or wanted to go leave for a period at a time to go see our colleagues in actions. And I got to tell you, not just language to language peers, but some of the greatest takeaways that I have and that I've been able to use in my own practice, I got from my colleagues of different disciplines. But again, you as the teacher leader, open your door, demonstrate that that's something that we should all be doing, and take that first step. All right, so it's 1:51 where I am on the East Coast. And so with that, I'm gonna say thank you. I'm also going to open up the floor to see if there are any questions, any concerns, and have a bit of a conversation here. I want to say thank you to all of you that participated in the chat. There was a really rich and robust chat going on there, and so thank you very much for that.
It was very rich indeed, wasn't it? Sorry, I had to. This was wonderful, Rich. Thank you so much. This was really, really enlightening. I really enjoyed hearing about it. And it's important that we're all here and know that we can take these steps to really take language teaching to where it should be, really.
Indeed.
Yeah. And if you wouldn't mind.
There it is.
Thank you for showing our little feedback slide. You guys have all, if you've been to our previous presentations this week, you all know, please, 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 not just for the sake of the giveaway, but also to give Rich some feedback on his presentation. Fill out that link, fill out the form attached to that link, scan the QR code. I will add the link to the chat if that's all right. And then please give him feedback on the presentation that I can share directly with him. And of course, if you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask.
Question in the chat: how do you feel about the 90% target language idea and the translanguaging movement? How do I feel about it? I think it all has to do with the values of the program. I think it all has to do with the context of the classroom, especially in areas with high heritage learners, for example. I mean, that the context of learning is so different. It's so different than other areas where the focus is specifically on learning the second language. I personally, I tell my students all the time, I don't want to pretend like we don't already have a first language. I don't want to pretend that we are not bilingual, and that our goal is to be bilingual, not necessarily only monolingual in a different language. And so in that respect, Florencia, I think that it's important that we recognize that explicitly, the idea that there's more than one language, and sometimes there's the amalgamation of language happening in our classrooms. Yeah, so I think that it's important to recognize that. But at the same time, a balance for how important the target language input is in the acquisition process. And I do think that there is a balance there somewhere. The air conditioning in my classroom turned off about 10 minutes into this presentation, and it's 1,000 degrees in here.
Your sacrifice is appreciated.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. All right, well, listen, I want to say thank you to everybody. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. Grant, thank you for hosting Extempore. I really appreciate it. This has been an impressive week.
We are happy to be here. I think Florencia has another good question if you want to read it, Rich.
How do we motivate higher ed people in being more involved with PD and associations? Florencia, I wish I knew, and this is, it's an aspect of my practice that I'm pretty far removed from. I think that it takes individuals like you, Florence. Again, this is where I go back to this idea of the teacher leader, the servant teacher leader, of just sticking their neck out and showing how important this is. In Pennsylvania, I've been a part of a lot of questions where, it's often, well, how can higher ed help bridge the proficiency gap between our students that are coming from K through 12 programs that are focused on proficiency, and then they move into higher ed programs that are then focused on a more traditional approach. But I agree with you that really the focus can also be, or should also be, how can we get higher ed more involved with professional development? I mean, I would love to see higher ed institutions or professors going in and leading PD in local districts, in local classrooms. I mean, I think that that's something that's so easily done, and also so beneficial, so powerful. And so, yeah, I agree. But Florency, again, I think it takes leaders from the higher ed community to do it first and to demonstrate that value. No doubt, no doubt. There needs to be mutual respect. I love the higher ed people to come on over. No incentive, right. And that's, that's a structural flaw. That's a structural flaw to the higher ed context. Indeed.
Rich, I have to ask one on my own. How do you, what's the approach for working with departments or teachers who might just be a bit, for lack of a better phrase, stuck in their ways, right? And they're convinced, and no matter what you do to really show or try to, demonstrate new ideas, they're just kind of, defensive, and they're just don't hear it.
So I think it's twofold. We have to kind of look, and those of us who are kind of program leaders or building leaders, department leaders, we have to kind of look with what's within our locus of control. When I first took on the role of department chair, I knew that I couldn't change what my colleagues are doing in their classrooms. Not only would I want to do that, I think that would be kind of an inappropriate intrusion on my part.
Right.
But what was in my locus of control, what I could control was, well, how are we assessing? And could we all be on the same page in terms of making the case for a communicative assessment? Mm-hmm. And so one of the first things that I did in that role is I made the case to incorporate the use of the integrated performance assessment.
Sure.
Not necessarily because that is the most perfect assessment model out there, but rather I knew that where we were versus where we wanted to be, that was a progressive step for us. And so I made the case, and my job as the department leader was to present that information. And then once we all kind of bought into the information in theory, we were able to move forward. And in that case, we developed those communicative assessments where I said, listen, if we're all jumping through the same communicative hoop, I don't care what you're doing in your classroom. And in fact, I want to celebrate that we all do things differently in our classrooms and we can still arrive to a communicative end. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the first things that we did. And right now that communication is so omnipresent in our program, it's only now that we're able to kind of go from there and say, okay, well, what's next? Can we take a more acquisition-driven approach as opposed, and kind of really shed some of that explicit instruction?
Awesome. Thank you, Rich.
Absolutely. Any other questions for the good of the group? All right.
Thank you again, Rich. If we're all wrapped up, please, yes, another big round of applause. Thank you, Rich.
Thanks, everybody.
All of the applause, snaps, fire emojis, whatever you want to share. Thank you to Rich for this fantastic presentation. We will be sure to have you back sometime soon. And please stay tuned for more of our PD Extravaganza. There's more to come later today, as well as tomorrow as well. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Rich, take care, everybody.